Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our guest today is Odessa Rae, who was the key in the formation of Ivanhoe Pictures, which produced the box office hit Crazy Rich Asians. After finishing a contract with Ivanhoe Pictures, Odessa has been producing independently. In 2018, she entered the documentary space by producing and directing a short documentary for the United Nations HCR called Clear Blue Skies. This project led to the production of a full-length documentary, The Story Won't Die, released by Amazon Prime. Odessa has become widely known for producing the highly acclaimed documentary Navalny, filmed during the winter of 2021 in Germany while embedded with the Navalny family. Navalny premiered at Sundance, winning Best of Fest and the coveted Audience Award for the US documentary competition. It has also won the Critics' Choice Award for Best Political Documentary. Odessa just returned from Ukraine, and we look forward to hearing her presentation. Over to you, Odessa.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durbak. Thank you for having me today. It's such a pleasure to be able to speak to an audience who cares about the situation in Ukraine right now. It's very dear to my heart as I have spent the most part of the last 6 months in Kiev and the surrounding areas since the war began. I was in Ukraine obviously before the war started, and about 2 weeks after the war began, I was in the center of Kiev. Just a little bit of background on how I ended up in the situation that I've been in for the last 6 months. I am a documentary film producer, and I made a film called Navalny, which is currently on HBO Max. So you can check it out on HBO Max. We are actually very fortunately a front runner for the Oscars this year, which I think is wonderful, not necessarily just for myself, but because the story that we are highlighting about Alexei Navalny is so important. Alexei Navalny is the last standing Russian opposition leader. He is sitting in prison in Russia. His situation gets worse every single day. Last week, they sentenced him to solitary confinement for the duration of his sentence, which as of now is about 13 years. He's facing another 15-year trial coming up in the next few months. All these trials are sham trials, and everyone knows that he will be released from prison when Putin is gone. So I made this very political documentary about Alexei Navalny. I was embedded with him in the Black Forest in Germany from recovering from the coma until going back to Russia. It was a very small team. It was myself and the director, Daniel Rohr, embedded in Russia and embedded in Germany. And we got to know Alexei Navalny very well and made this film about him, which you can see on HBO Max. So that's just a little bit of background on myself. And because I made a very political film, when the war in Ukraine started, Christo Grozev, who is a very renowned journalist from Bellingcat, asked me to go in with him to figure out another story there. And about 2 weeks after the war started, we went in with the team and we started to look into what stories could we tell in Ukraine that would be able to capture what's happening at the moment. And what I ended up doing is for the last 6 months, I have been embedded with the Ukrainian negotiating team. So the Ukrainian negotiating team is about 5 members, very close to President Zelensky. It is sort of the envoys of Zelensky, made up of David Arakamia, Podolek, Rustem Umerov, the foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba. And I follow in particular 2 members of that team very closely. Dmytro Kuleba, who's the foreign minister of Ukraine, and Rustem Umerov, who is a Crimean Tatar who also handles a lot of the back channel communications for the Ukrainian government. So I have watched very carefully and been privy to the conversations around negotiations on the whole. Negotiations started with macro negotiations held in Belarus and Turkey, which I think you heard about, where the Ukrainians did come to the table prepared to negotiate something that would create a ceasefire and a quick end to the war. But as I understand, Lavrov, who is the foreign minister of Russia, arrived at the official negotiations, and while everyone on the Ukrainian side thought that, you know, there's a Russian narrative that they see and hear about on Channel 1, but behind closed doors, they thought that they would be able to have a real conversation. Lavrov arrived at those negotiations and basically laughed and said, well, we're just here to denazify Ukraine. So with that talking point, they basically knew that there was no negotiations that they really wanted to have. And as we all know, Russia thought that they would take Ukraine in a week. They had, in the early days of the war, Lukashenko, who is the former Russian puppet president, sitting in Belarus, waiting to retake his throne in Kiev. So they were very, very much prepared for a 1-week-long war that did not go as planned. So after these macro negotiations, well, they continued. There were a couple. There was one in Belarus. There was one in Minsk, and then when Bucha happened, that's when everything changed. Basically, Bucha was the realization for the Ukrainian people that that negotiations were not possible, because Russia was just there to, as an act of genocide, to murder Ukrainians and take away their culture. The Russian narrative is that the Ukrainian language doesn't even exist in some very, you know, if you watch Solovyev or the Russian propagandists on TV, the Ukrainian language does not exist. The Ukrainian people are delusional Russians that need to be reminded that they are Russians. And it's absurd, but with Bucha and with the war crimes that happened in Bucha, they realized that there was a genocidal nature to this war, and any kind of negotiations was giving up that piece of land to basically be raped and murdered by Russian soldiers. So the negotiations switched at that point to the grain situation, which Rustem Umerov, who is one of the main characters of my documentary, was absolutely instrumental in accomplishing. He is a Crimean Tatar, so his relationship with the Turkish government, with Erdogan specifically, was very instrumental. Erdogan has played a role in the negotiations thanks to his relationship with the Crimean Tatars and Rustem Umerov. The grain situation was very difficult to negotiate for, Another thing, another part of the negotiations that I follow now is negotiations for weapons, which is highly debated. You know, should we be giving more support? Should we be giving support when it's taking away from the American people, from the energy system, the energy crisis that Europe is facing? Is it right to be financing a war in Ukraine when we have to face problems for this? And I just want to speak about this for a minute because I will tell you what is the reality here that is actually not printed in the news, as I believe we are in a confidential conversation. But Biden said in the early days that he would allocate $40 billion for the Ukrainian war effort. And as did the rest of the nations, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, everyone has pledged a lot of support. And the realistic number that actually has come to Ukraine is about 7% of what's been promised, between 5 and 7%. Of the 40 billion, I think there's only maybe about 4 billion of it cleared at this point. So less than that, so maybe 10%. But of that 4 billion, not all of it can even be used on weapons. It's a mixture of humanitarian aid, rebuilding, etc. So the people who go on about $20 billion going here, or $40 billion going there, if you look at the amount of money we spent on Afghanistan, even in a year, you know, we are definitely supporting, but we are way, way, way below what our military spends are. And we are actually supporting them very conservatively. They are doing a miraculous job with the support they are getting. They truly are. And they're getting help, obviously, from NATO, from intelligence, but those Ukrainians, every single person from the baker to the interior designer's husband to the school teacher has signed up to fight. And the other thing that they've done very creatively, and I've followed very closely Fedorov's team, Mikhailo Fedorov, who is the digital transformation minister. He created something called the IT Army, and they have fought this war very creatively through tech, through disinformation campaigns, through battling Russian disinformation. They created an app called the DIA app, which basically mobilizes every single Ukrainian citizen, because you can go on that app and even your 80-year-old grandmother can upload the location of a Russian soldier. So they have been incredibly creative in their war efforts and fully using every single little crumb they have received. So yes, when I visit Washington, D.C. with the negotiating team to ask for more weapons, you really see what they're asking for to win the war versus what they're getting, which sustains the war. And I think that that's all that is sort of willing to give right now, because they are obviously nervous about escalation. I know Biden doesn't want to be the president to start the nuclear war. They think that Ukraine might go and take back Crimea, which I think is a sensitive subject because because they think that would escalate it. So basically, they are not receiving the support that you would think they receive. And most of it comes from internal just ability to use what they've been given. But that's not to say that the West has not really, really united and given a lot of support. They're very, very grateful for everything they've gotten, which is why you will never hear them complaining on the news or to the newspapers about the gap between what's been promised and what they're actually receiving. But the reality is that it's not, I think, something that is massively affecting the crisis that we're facing, or the energy system. Well, the energy system in Europe is slightly different because they did build channels to be dependent on Russian oil and gas. So that is their own separate issue. So based on that, I suppose, well, I don't know. Do you want me to take some questions or just keep going with different anecdotes from the time? I'm happy to do either way.
Basically, the only thing that I would like to point out that since the 16th century, the Russians have been trying to absorb Ukraine. Before, they were too busy being the servants of Genghis Khan for 200 years.
Correct.
And before that, Kievska Rus started in 988, and in the 1200s, the daughter of Yaroslav Mudry became the Queen of France. So when I hear Macron talking, I start laughing. So I think that what the history points that basically, for some delusional reason, Russia has thought that they basically are Kievska Rus, which has nothing to do with it. Both Peter I decided that he was going to call Moscovia, that's what Russia was called. He was going to take the name of half of the name of Kievska Rus. He was going to make Moscovia Russia, and they do not know that either.
Yeah.
So the problem is that we know the saying, if you don't study history, you repeat it, and this is what's continuing on.
Absolutely.
Okay, over back to you, Odessa.
No, absolutely. And a lot of people don't know that, Kiev is older than Moscow. Kiev is 800 years old. And what's interesting to look at in history also is that their entire struggle since the birth of the nation has been independence from this sort of big brother that wanted to constantly absorb them and massively abused the population within Ukraine. I mean, you can look at Holodomor, right? We are actually in the week this week of, I think, 100 years since Holodomor. Something like that. I know it's a big year. I think it was 19. Anyways, Holodomor
it's in the 1930s. It's a little bit late, but you are
maybe
correct.
It's 90th anniversary, because Ukraine is doing some things around this. So it was basically this time when Russia wanted to take all of their grain and sell it for their own purposes, lined their pockets with gold. They sold it abroad and they took the rest. And they had military surrounding the villages of Ukraine and the towns so that they couldn't go in search of food anywhere. And during the winter, about 3.5 million Ukrainians died of starvation. So this is the big brother that they have sort of always dealt with on the other side. And what I have understood from my friends within the Ukrainian government is when the Nazis came along during the war, the only thing they looked at and the only thing they cared about was independence from the Soviet Union, was independence from this horrible, evil brother that had basically tried to absorb them and murder them at every crossing. And the only reason they actually sided with the Nazis in the beginning, because they didn't understand their agenda, they didn't have this understanding that they were coming in to kill Jews, was because they saw it as an army that was coming in to fight the Soviet regime. And so anything that was coming in to fight the Soviet regime, they were going to be on the side of that. And they realized that this was obviously a mistake. So this is how, I have understood that situation from my friends in the foreign ministry, actually. And And I think it's very important to also understand that this whole narrative around Nazis in Ukraine is absolutely just Russian propaganda, because I get this question a lot outside of it, but aren't there a lot of Nazis in Ukraine? I'm like, this is just absolutely crazy. There's there's a huge Hasidic Jewish population in Ukraine. It is the 250 years, I think, the birthplace of the leader of the Hasidic Jewish
Yes, that's correct.
lineage. Yes. And
Near Chernobyl.
yes, exactly.
Yes, I
And
was there.
the whole Nazi narrative, if you want to understand where it comes from, it's because in 2014, when the war started in the East, this is shortly after this is when the Russian Nazi propaganda started. So when the war started in the East in 2014, there was a group of sort of ragtag fighters who came together, and they formed what was called the Azov Battalion. And these people were furious with the Russian invasion, which was very much a Russian invasion, even though there's different things talked about. The Ukrainian separatists, it's even now, I think, being proved in this case that's happening with MH17, also because the plane, the Buk that shot down MH17 was during these early periods of the 2014 war. The Ukrainian separatists that wanted to separate from Russia were actually paid, for the most part, they were paid mercenaries that were that wanted independence, that were under the Wagner private military company banner. So Putin's private military company is called Wagner, and he sent in mercenaries dressed in civilian clothing to pretend that they were Ukrainian separatists, and they were civilians with weapons. They were actually Russian mercenaries who were paid to go in and start the unrest in the East, in Donbass, Donetsk. And so when this started, there were a group of ragtag civilians who came together and formed what is called the Azov Battalion. The Azov Battalion was led by some very right-wing, very Nazi jargon throwing, misogynistic, the typical sort of very, very, like I said, right-wing Nazi rhetoric vibe leadership. And they were just angry, far-right Ukrainian soldiers who formed this battalion that they started fighting the Russians with. But this battalion became very, very successful. They were just very tough. They fought very hard, and they were the ones who managed to, keep the Russians at the front line, at the lines of conflict that they had established when they came in. So because this battalion grew, and the battalion was not necessarily completely filled with, Nazi rhetoric, spewing leadership. It was just a bunch of young kids who wanted to fight the Russians. And then what happened was the Ukrainian government noticed that this battalion was one of the strongest fighting resources that they had in the East. And so they wanted actual Ukrainian army support to go to this battalion. So they absorbed that battalion into the official army of Ukraine. And the leadership of the battalion, that was very Nazi esque, was actually removed, and different leadership was put in. But this battalion then became a part of the official Ukrainian military. So when Russia paints the government as being Nazis, they turn to this former leadership. They turn to this battalion. They say, look, they have an agenda of, just killing Russians. For them, Nazism is actually doesn't have much to do with the Jews. It has to do with just killing Russians. And so they point at them and they say, well, look at this battalion. They are Nazi. They are part of the Ukrainian government. I mean, I have been embedded with the Ukrainian government for the last 6 months, and the majority of them are Jews. they are not Nazis. You know, Zelensky's a Jew, Yermak is a Jew, Podolek. It's just an absolute absurd thing. But when Russian propaganda point towards it, they point towards this Azov battalion. And those were actually the last guys standing in the steel plant. I think you must have heard about the steel plant in Azovstal. It was like the last standing holdout in Mariupol before it was taken by the Russian military. And those guys were captured. A lot of those Azov battalion guys who were just young kids who wanted to join the strongest fighting unit. They were captured, they were tortured. I don't know if you heard about the prison in the east, in the Donetsk People's Republic, that was holding about 130 of those Azov soldiers. They actually, in the summer, they actually negotiated with Rustem Umerov the release of these soldiers back to Ukraine as prisoners of war. And 2 days later, they sent a missile into the prison, killing about 75 of them and injuring another 40. So they negotiated a release full knowing that they were just going to massacre them. And Christo Grozev from Bellingcat actually proved that they had been digging mass graves around the prison about 5 days before. So before they even agreed to the prisoner swap. So that sort of explains the Nazi rhetoric exactly that you hear, you know, which is just completely false. I have to say.
One of our directors in Ukraine, who is Anna Kapustyan, whose family lived through the Holodomor. She wrote, she presented an article and she wrote about it, which is going to be published in our World Ecology Report. She has previously spoken about the massacres. And one of the interesting parts is that Russia was selling Ukrainian grain to the current European nations. And you would think that they would feel an obligation to be standing up for Ukrainian independence now. And I must say, they are doing it very, very slowly, even though Germany is sort of improving its assistance, but mainly the small countries that were formerly under the Russia are also doing much more.
And just to jump forward to today's leadership of Ukraine, you know, because I have to say, what's interesting about my personal story is before I was making the film Navalny, I was actually in Ukraine making a film about Wagner, about the Wagner operation in eastern Ukraine that was masterminded by the Ukrainian Secret Service to capture some of those early mercenaries that were causing the unrest in the east. And that whole story was actually led by the opposition party of Zelensky. So my introduction to Ukraine was I was actually put on a military surveillance list by Zelensky, and I had to sneak out of the country, basically fake my departure and run around meeting my sources in forests with burner phones and smashing my regular phones. I was followed. It was quite unfortunate. And I was part of the opposition party that was actually taking down the Zelensky government. We all laugh about it now because I did not make that film. We ended up putting it, we ended up shelving it. We made Navalny instead. We felt that that needed a little bit more research. And then I went back and I started making a film with the Zelensky government. And I went in with all my questions about the Zelensky government. They were very much, you know, very unpopular before the war started. There was a lot of discussion around Yermak, who is his number two, that he was a Russian puppet, and Zelensky was basically a puppet to him, etc. And I went in skeptical. I went in with a lot of questions, and I have watched that team so closely for the last 6 months. And I have to just say, they mean well in every fiber of their being. They use every bit of energy and life And I have not seen any signs of corruption. You know, people go on about corruption at the highest leadership of Ukrainian government. They just appointed Rustem Umerov, who I know very, very well now, the Crimean Tatar, who is the back channel negotiator. And they appointed him to reshape the Ukrainian sovereign fund. So it's the Ukrainian state property fund. What they're doing is basically gathering and sort of privatizing all their state assets, which there's about 3,000 industries that make up the state assets, and they're privatizing it in an effort to fund the war, to help their country survive this, to keep the economy going. Every action that they do it moves against corruption and the sort of old patterns that you would see in Yanukovych or Yushchenko governments. You know, Zelensky's heart and soul is absolutely in this. You know, he's not in it because he wants to profit off of it, or there's some kind of gain in it for him. You know, a week ago, 10 days ago, I was in the president's office in Kiev interviewing Timoshenko, who's one of his team. He's one of those 5 people that was on the original selfie walkabout where they said, we are here to stay. And there was an air raid, and the air raid rang. And because Kiev is actually being hit right now, we went down into Zelensky's bunker. And this was probably one of the most amazing moments of my last 6 months. And I sat in Zelensky's bunker with Timoshenko and a few others for a while, listening to stories about the early days of the war. In the early days, you know, they all went down into the bunker. There was about 12 of them that sat in this bunker for 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks at the beginning of the war, while Russia was closing in on Kiev. And they sat there, and they every day, you know, sort of watched as Wagner and Russia got closer and strategized and fought and did what they could. And Timoshenko, Kirilo, came downstairs one day because they would pop up sometimes for air to look about, or, you know, and then came down one day and Zelensky was sitting there. He said, okay, this was about a week in, maybe 10 days in, and they had posted that walkabout selfie that they're here, you know, and he was thinking in his mind, okay, we're here, we're sitting, you know, but there's a plan B. And he said to Zelensky, so he was thinking, you know, there's tunnels, there's roads, there's what's the plan B? And so he goes to Zelensky, what's the plan B? You know, if the soldiers actually get within 100 meters of the government, you know, what's plan B here? And Zelensky turned to him and said, I'm just going to sit here. And he was like, well, he's like, there's no escape plan, basically. He's like, oh, no, I'm just going to sit here, you know, but you can leave. Everyone should leave. We'll figure out an escape plan. And there's these roads and tunnels and da-da-da. And Timoshenko's like, but I just took this selfie with you. I'm like one of the main targets of the Russian army now. And he's like, well, then I guess you're just going to sit here with me. And so there really was no plan B, you know, and that is the way that I've seen them fight. There's of course, there's those moments of questioning. The summer was very tough because there was not much movement and they weren't getting much help. You know, Germany was really stalling a lot of the support from Europe, and the US it was very slow. I sat there all summer and morale was getting very low. Russia was taking inch by inch more territory, but what they did was they held on. They gathered the weapons that they were slowly getting for a very smart offensive, which they launched in September very successfully, which they've been running ever since. Yes, for them, there is no plan B. Because they know and they can see that there is no plan B. There's genocide and there's the erasure of the Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian language, or there is to fight. And that is really what you see there. And obviously there's people that are exhausted by the war effort and exhausted. I know a lot of young kids who signed up for the territorial defense, and now they just want the fighting to be over. They just want life to go back to normal. But there really is no way out other than international support. Without the international support, they would be completely dead. People always ask me, so how does this end for them? And I say, it's your choice, because this war is entirely being run by international support at this point. They have run out of resources internally, trust me. The stockpiles in the Soviet warehouses are completely gone. It's entirely our choice as Western nations.
That's very, very important that you point that out, because that's absolutely correct. America promised 40 billion, and now from what you're saying, they gave less than 10. Okay, the rest of the nations promise a lot, but words are very easy. It's the actions that count.
And I totally agree here. We are in a time where we need to seriously look at this situation and understand that you are fighting a force like Hitler. They are fighting it for us. Putin is someone, from all my understanding of being in his innermost worlds and workings for the last 2 years of my life, from Russian opposition to Ukraine, he is someone that does not want to stop. He will expand if he is allowed to. And we have to send a strong message. And this conservatism to not fight this war in the American government is wrong, because if you look at Putin, he does a lot more. His bark is louder than his bite, right? He says, if you send NATO standard weapons to Ukraine, I will react with, I will send nuclear, but nothing happens. If NATO and Sweden join NATO, if Sweden and Finland join NATO, I will react, nothing happens. He shouts a lot. There is an ability to just take this regime down, to humiliate him in front of the Russian public, to get them to mobilize, to remove him within his inner circles. And this is the only path forward. This is not a leader that we can work with on the global stage anymore. And China is the same thing. We are facing the same problem with China and Russia. And I absolutely do not agree with, the direction of the American government when they allow things that move us in the direction of, like you said, communism, socialism. I grew up in Hong Kong for a majority part of my youth. My father's lived in Hong Kong for 34 years, and I've watched what's happened in Hong Kong since '97 with the Chinese takeover. These are forces that we do not want in this country or on this planet, and that is why I feel very passionate about helping this situation as much as possible and telling their stories.
But Odessa, there's one thing, there's a very important saying that I teach my patients: fear of the wolf is bigger than the wolf. And the problem is that the West is just afraid of nuclear. They don't realize that if Russia starts storing nuclear, they can get hit right back. Now, unfortunately, the American government did not listen to Churchill when he told both Roosevelt and Truman that they need to contain Stalin's expansionism, and they ignored it.
Yeah, agreed. And the sad reality is, and I think Russia understands this, is that if they did use nuclear weapons, I don't think the response from the US would be nuclear.
Over to you, Ariel.
Thank you, Dr. Durbak, and thank you so much, Odessa. That was a wonderful, wonderful, and extremely insightful presentation that the questions definitely have poured in. So to begin with, in your opinion, how did the world react to the war in Ukraine? And should foreign media have paid more attention to this issue?
Well, in the beginning, actually, foreign media was very devoted to telling the story of the Ukrainian war. I think it took up I know from CNN, because our film Navalny was also produced by CNN Films, that I think it was 85% of their news feed. So for the first 2 months, it was really reported on quite widely, and that was great. But now they struggle to get press, and they struggle to communicate what's actually happening in Ukraine, and they look for different opportunities for press about what's happening in Ukraine to reach the international community. And unfortunately, war fatigue sets in, and you are seeing global fatigue on the Ukrainian war. And I think that is very dangerous, because that's what Putin has been counting on. And he's waiting for the world to forget and to stop caring and to stop sending weapons and to stop reporting on it. And he has time. Time is on his side. So now is more dangerous than in the early days. The early days, it was quite sufficient, the press media that it got.
Do you think only Putin is to blame for the military aggression against Ukraine, or is the entire Russian people also guilty? After all, it is not Putin who kills and rapes children, but ordinary men from Russia. Who should be responsible, the government or the whole people?
Well, I do think that it is Putin and like 4 people at the top who basically are waging the war. And they have a very, very strong grip on media in that country. You have to understand there is no free press. The free press have been entirely chased out of Russia. There are 1 or 2 people, organizations, including the Navalny organization, that still try to get news in via YouTube, which is still operating. They operate from exile, so they're in exile, but basically sending in as much news as they can that is real news. But the state media is so strong, so the Russian people I mean, I've spent a lot of time with the Fedorov team, who actually their whole job is to try and understand the Russian mentality. And I think the sentiment, like they don't like what's going on. There is like confusion about what's going on because it's been painted in a very different way. You can't even say it's a war in Russia. It's a special military operation. And you cannot even acknowledge things. And then there was the whole mobilization, which means when they put in a draft. And so there's things that are, there's definitely a portion of the population that are speaking out against the war and are anti-war who have been arrested. And the sentence is quite severe. It's 10 years. So there is no voice of dissent or other voice in the country. It's very hard to get accurate information about what's actually happening. And the war is really Putin's war. It's not Russia's war, but they are a nation. You have to understand that it's never known democracy. They came from Stalin to like a gangster period to Putin, and well, there was obviously Gorbachev as well, who was great, but this is a population that have never really known democracy. They have been told their entire existence, their DNA, they have been told what is happening. They're not a population that have been allowed to just decide what they want and fight for that in their country, so the whole system is problematic. And as for like the soldiers, of course, in the towns, like that's unspeakable, and I can't make excuses for soldiers, but I wouldn't say that it's Russia's war. I would still say it's Putin's war. In their mentality, they've never known, there is not this thought process that like, oh, we can disagree with our leadership in this, there's another option. Like, it's very difficult. They just come from a different lineage and a different history, So what we think is very natural, well, they should just fight it. It's the people, they should just speak about it. That thinking is not something that's even in their DNA,
That is correct. They were first under the Tsars, then under Genghis Khan, the same mentality, and then under Peter and Katerina and Stalin and Putin now. So,
yeah.
The next question that we have is, in your opinion, why are Ukrainian refugees treated unfavorably in some countries? And how do you tell such people that there is a war in Ukraine?
Well, unfavorably, I think, well, for the most part, I think the Ukrainian refugees have received a hugely warm-hearted welcome. I know that Poland is housing about 2 million, and there's no refugee camp. So if you look at like the crisis in 2015 with the Syrian refugees and you compare it to what's happening in Ukraine, like everyone you speak to has like 3 or 4 Ukrainians in their home, you know? So the response has been incredibly different. So for any kind of dissent or dislike of the Ukrainian refugee situation, it's really just because if you look at Poland again, you know, what I hear is just that, I mean, now there's housing shortages, right? There's job shortages. There's rent is going up. There's they just, how does a city and a population handle an influx of many more people that need to start supporting themselves and live? And so it just stretches the resources of the city. And of course, for people who are like less sympathetic to the war, I can see them just being fed up with the situation, you know? And that's, I think, very natural. It's tough. It's unfortunate, but it's going to be challenging for some. So that's how I would explain that. And the thing you know, actually before making Navalny and this Ukrainian film, I made a film about the Syrian refugee situation. And the one thing I have discovered from my many, many days and time within circles of refugees from various countries or refugee camps is they all want to go home. Like that is their preference. You know, they don't want to live in another country and figure it out and start all over. They liked being home, most of them, you know, and that's what I have discovered.
I agree. Most of the people and I have people here, and everybody is looking forward to when they can get back. But in the meantime, they're all getting jobs and they're all trying to be able not to be a burden to the people that are helping them.
Yeah, my friend, I met a girl on the plane coming back from Kiev 10 days ago, and it's just randomly we started chatting. She was about my age, and she said she's had 6 or 7 Ukrainian refugees, like two or three families, staying in her home in Copenhagen, and they stayed in her home for 3 months in the beginning of the war, and then they went back to Kiev actually. And she said when they left, my house was better than when they came because they fixed everything. And this is like the genius about bringing in a culture that is just different from you. Everything that was broken in the yard, the trampoline, the oven, the different things, the wall, the door, the windows, they just went around fixing everything. So they were waiting to figure out what was going on with their own country. So it was actually a very positive experience, but I'm sure there's all kinds of experiences, but yeah.
Next question, Ariel.
Well, which help in the war in Ukraine is now the most important? Spreading information about Russia's crimes, financial support, or armed reinforcements?
Weapons. And it's really weird for me to even say that. I'm a liberal, like, you know, minded person. I never thought I would be sitting here saying, can you please send this country weapons? You know, I've been very anti-war my whole life, but in this situation, of course, all of the above, you know, spread information about the war, talk about it within your circles, within your friend circles, make sure that it stays in the narrative, because keeping it in the narrative keeps governmental support coming.
Thank you. In your opinion, what is the main advantage of Ukrainians in this war, and how can we combat Russian propaganda?
How to combat Russian propaganda? Well, I guess on your social media channels, you know, one thing you can do is understand what Russian propaganda is as well. I really love following this Twitter channel, Julia Davis. She translates all Russian nightly news. And so you can sort of see the Russian rhetoric. You can see for yourself what's actually being said in Russia to the Russian population. And And then follow as well, I don't know if you guys use Telegram, but Ukraine Now, the English channel, because you'll see daily, just very live daily accounts of the war. And if you have a social media channel, or you have a Facebook channel, or you have circles of friends, educate yourself and then speak about the absurdities of where people come with Russian propaganda. Because for example, I get a lot of questions in the United States that actually are coming from Russian propaganda, right? Like I had said earlier, well, isn't the money being embezzled, that is supposed to be going to weapons? Or what about the Nazis? Like there really are, right? So educate yourself and then speak about it from an educated place, and just be able to, confront people who are continuing the Russian propaganda thinking within our own country, right? When a country comes in and invades another country, murders their people because they don't believe that it should exist, obviously there's one country that is fighting for the truth here, which is just existence, which is just like life. I do believe that that is something you can look to say there is a right and wrong in this situation. It isn't actually like a nuanced proxy war where you're fighting.
You had said earlier about social media and how Putin's been waiting for it to kind of die down, and just with how generally, the public do participate in trends and waves, and then it kind of just disappears. Is there any way that you'd recommend for people in the social media realm to try to bring back the sentiments that you're talking about, help re-educate the public, but to get the public back invested into trying to participate in making this go away?
Well, that's where I think sharing, some great information from, because Telegram, I don't know if you guys are on Telegram. I will just tell you the name of this one channel that I follow, because you can just download videos and then you can post them on your social media. It's like they make it for you, and it brings awareness, and it's like raw footage, like, and most people, when I post them, they're like, where did you get that? Did you shoot that yourself? And no, you just can download it on Telegram, or Julia Davis. You can even just get, screen record her videos and educate the public on like what's actually being said in Russia. And there's a lot of interesting content there. Or follow Christo Grozev, who's on Twitter, who's an incredible investigative journalist who is basically fighting disinformation. And there's so many interesting stories that you can retweet or repost. Christo Grozev, Maria Pevchik, who's the head of investigations for the Navalny team. She's the one who found and discovered that there was a massive $100 million yacht in Italy that was actually owned by Putin. I think you heard about it. She's the one who publicized it. She's the one who got the Italian authorities to seize it. And so these stories, she's the one who discovered that Lavrov's daughter was living in a $30 million flat in London. She got it seized. She got her sanctioned. So, repost these interesting stories, because these investigators like Christo, Maria, Ukraine Now, there's an English channel on Telegram, Christo, Maria are on Twitter. You can just repost what they're doing, because they're interesting, they're fascinating little tidbits to share. And I think it gets people interested. Like when people followed those stories, like the Lavrov's daughter and the yacht, the 100 million yacht that was actually Putin's, So just, follow these interesting people's channels and repost what they're doing, I would say.
Thank you. We just got a whole new wave of questions, so I'm going to go back into those. Any kind of support during the war is certainly very important. In your opinion, what is more important, psychological support or material support? And then the second question in that is, how does help from countries that support Ukraine now affect the course of war in general?
Okay, well, you know, first of all, I'll say the material support is more important at this stage. And obviously, how does it affect the rest of the countries to be, you know, getting involved in this conflict?
In your opinion, is the reaction of the world leaders to the genocide of Ukraine sufficient?
No, because if it was, you know, this is where like a population is so numb. We just discovered another genocide in Izium, right? There were 450 unmarked graves there. Like in Ukraine, they say, what do we have to get to? You know, 100,000, 200,000 deaths. I mean, the reality is, if you want to actually know the numbers, because I do have an understanding of the numbers, it's now around 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers that have been killed. It's probably another 40,000 that have been injured. And who knows the civilian count, because we don't know what's happened in Mariupol, you know, but it's thousands and thousands. And on the Russian side, it's probably about 70,000 Russian soldiers dead, another 50,000 wounded. You know, it's a lot of people that are dying in this conflict. And we just, yeah, there is an ability for the West to actually just end the war if they gave enough weapons, you know, but they just give what bleeds Putin versus what ends Putin.
How many volunteers do you think are fighting in Ukraine right now?
I don't actually know. And I wouldn't want to guess. But it's a lot. Like I said, you know, it's everyone from the jazz musician who was going to go to jazz school in September to the husband of the woman who runs the film institute that I know in Kiev. Like, it's very unlikely people, to the young girls that you drive across the border. You know, there is a huge there was a huge sign up percentage.
What do you think is the most necessary assistance from other countries for Ukraine to continue to liberate cities and achieve victory in the end?
Weapons.
Yeah.
Give them the weapons, they'll do the work. That's what they say to everyone. Just give us the weapons, we'll do the dirty work. Yeah.
Back to you, Ariel.
How are weapons getting to Ukraine right now? And what countries are the majority for supplying the weapons?
Number one is actually the United States. Number two is the UK. And number three is actually Turkey, even though that's not publicized. They've been very supportive with the drones and various other weapons. And they mostly come to Ukraine via Poland.
Back to you, Ariel.
With the world that's so centric around war, and with how many genocides that are going on in the world and have gone on, do you think that there is a possible future without genocide and without war? Or do you think that will always be an innate part of humanity?
No, I think that we are hopefully evolving, and I choose to believe that that will be our evolution and one day our reality. Absolutely.
Do you think that there are certain steps to get us there? Or do you think this will all kind of just be watching the pattern of history and trying to learn from it?
No, I do believe in one step, actually, and it's something that I don't know, I have come to see throughout my life, is the power of building community, which is why I think it's so important what you've done here, Dr. Durbak, is the power of community. Because when you have a village, when you have a community, when you communicate and have organization with people where you spread ideas and you talk about things and you have a familial relationship with your neighbors, with, you know, this isolationist ideas is what leads us into being very far from connecting with an Iraqi or a Pakistani or an Afghan or a Ukrainian. You know, make friends, understand different cultures, travel, find a way to create a community, whether it's locally or globally, and, you know, respect the people that you know, and love them and go out of your way to be kind to strangers. And all of it, I think, has a collective effect, honestly. And that's how we get there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Because
Doc-
that's one thing you actually saw in the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which was so beautiful. And it's sad that like it takes a war to push humanity into this mentality, is everyone came together. They were all in something together. And there was this sense that there was no you and me. There was, how can I help you? There were strangers helping strangers in the most taxing ways, in the most uncomfortable ways. But like that, they built a mesh, a fabric of a collective and of a group. And there's a beautiful outcome of this war in Ukraine, which is this new collectiveness, this new coming together that they have experienced and created since the war. And I would just hope that we can create it without being pushed to the brink of war,
Well, Odessa, that's a wonderful sentiment for us to end on. And I just want to thank you very, very much for all your basically eloquent presentation of the situation and the factual events that are taking place in Ukraine. And I do hope that eventually the free world will get together and try to assist Ukraine in order to be able to achieve its freedom, which they have been fighting for a very long time. So again, thank you very much, Ariel. Thank you very much for hosting. Take good care of yourself and have a wonderful week.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much for having me. Bye.
Thank you both. Bye.